Hello, we are Gamut Inc. and unfortunately we can't be with you today as we are just getting to know the organ landscape of Japan. And this for the next 3 months. And we are happy to at least in this way introduce you to a couple of positions on the automation of music that play a big role in our work. And we are sitting here in the garden of Villa Kamogawa in Kyoto, and we thought it's a very good scenario for the title of our talk, which is Second Nature.
The degrees of automation can vary widely. We look at a few areas of music that can be automated. That is automation of the instruments, automation of the composition process, automation of the interpretation. From the interaction of these three elements, something can emerge that we will call hypervirtuosity. First, to the automation of instruments. It is really surprising how early the automation of instruments started.
As early as 1500 before Christ, automatic flute machines and water clocks were already known in Egypt. Around 200 before Christ, Xebios described hydraulic principles in Greece, and in the West he is considered the inventor of the organ. Heron of Alexandria developed the prototype of Xebios with several pipe rows further to a self-playing instrument controlled by water pressure. Self-playing organs were an attraction at the court of Byzance. During the Arab Renaissance in the 9th century, the Banu Musa brothers, students at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, further developed the art of musical machines. In their book of ingenious devices on automata and mechanical devices, around 850, they show more than 100 amazing musical machines, self-playing flutes, which can also be recorded mechanically.
In the era of enlightenment, with Descartes, a machine conception of the world solidified, and with it an automation enthusiasm. Flute clocks belonged to the upscale homes, and all kinds of automata are made for entertainment. In the 18th century, the philosopher Julien Offray de la Métrie even described people as upright crawling machines. From the 19th century to the 1920s was the peak of machine music, with orchestrons and a variety of music automatons which were often used in pubs and fairs because they were loud enough. Aeolian Organ and Music Company in the USA, Gebrüders de Kapp Antwerpen, Belgium, Welte and Hupfeld in Germany were large-scale companies. Hupfeld, for example, had around 1,500 employees at its peak time. In 1924, more player pianos were sold in the USA than ordinary ones.
Due to the improvement of the phonograph and the stock market crash of 1929, the entire industry was displaced within a few years. A revival of sorts followed in the 1980s. Music rolls were replaced by MIDI commands. The pioneer was the Yamaha disc clavier. Somebody here at the Villa Kamogawa told us that during the pandemic, disc claviers were officially used in piano competitions and even in auditions for the conservatory. Thus, non-European applicants could apply for piano studies at the Freiburg Conservatory with their own MIDI recordings on the disc clavier. Several artistic projects have dedicated themselves to music made specifically for automata. There's to name the Logos Foundation in Ghent, which has developed an entire orchestra of machines and with which we work together for several projects.
In recent years, access to inexpensive microcomputers and simplified programming possibilities has also given rise to a very active maker scene, which realizes a wide variety of music machine projects worldwide. Since we both come from a different musical background, Marion from electronics and I'm from instrumental music, the discovery of automated organ was a breakthrough for us. Finally, we were able to implement our ideas of computer control with acoustic sounds. Together with the instrument maker Gerhard Kern, then we developed our own music machines. Our fisharmonica, for example, is an accordion but with the bellows of an organ. It has 8 motors with which the wind flow can be controlled in the 2 wind chambers, as well as the register loops can be turned on and off, but also they can be slide in and slide off, so you get like fade in, fade out effects similar to a filter in electronic music.
Then there is another instrument that we like very much. We call it the bojo because it's a combination of banjo with ebos. The instrument is an electronic acoustic hybrid. The strings are made to vibrate by electromagnets, while the sound is amplified by resonators. Advancing automation may also further blur the line between electronic and acoustic sound production. The Logos Foundation in Ghent, a pioneer in the art of automatic instruments, does not actually use bellows for some of its wind instruments, but instead uses membranes to create a standing wave in the tube. The so-called hibber, it's one of the organs that the Logos Foundation built. They put a loudspeaker inside each tube with a fixed wavelength that is proportional to the resonant frequency of the tube length in order to create a standing wave inside it. Also no wind machine attached. And so you have access to a lot of really very interesting and weird sounds. Now that brings us to the second chapter, automation of composition. Today, artificial intelligence is also advertised as being able to write music. For example, the song Daddy's Car was created to sound like the Beatles, or the AI project Beethoven 10 is an AI that completed Beethoven's 10th Symphony. So the piece premiered on October 9, 2021. Besides these more showy and in some way reactionary examples, musicians are using artificial intelligence in various creative ways to make music. The American electronic musician Holly Herndon used an AI called Spawn, trained by her voice, for her album Proto. Many electronic musicians use a mixture of automated plugins in DAWs and more complex software patches, as well as machine learning algorithms to create highly individual systems of interaction to compose and to improvise with machines.
They can look back on a long tradition of algorithmic composition in which formal processes are used to make music with minimal human intervention. Different approaches to automated composition, like rule-based and stochastic, are mixed and mingled these days. But even the classic approaches show a variety of automation degrees. Yanis Xenakis, for example. In his compositions, he used the power of the computer to make stochastic compositions, but arranged them by hand again and let it play by an traditional ensemble. Another interesting example would be Ligeti's use of pattern mechanical composition in several of his works. It has a more aesthetic approach of machine-like sounds rather than the classic algorithmic approach. While the Iliac Suite from 1957 was the first piece to be composed by a computer, Athanasius Kircher built the Arca Musa Rhythmica, an automatic composition machine, as early as in the 17th century. With the help of this box, 4-part compositions, canonic pieces, could be created with the use of cue cards. Canons are a very good example of algorithmic composition before the computer. Once set in motion, there is little for the composer to decide. Formal processes, as used in algorithmic compositions, have been familiar to music ever since. The Iliac Suite, as well as Xenakis' pieces, were creating with the help of computers, but these scores were performed by live performers on traditional instruments.
This brings us to our third chapter, the automation of interpretation. Alone the machine lacks the inner power of the mind, said E.T.A. Hoffmann in his short story Die Automate, which is about musical apparatus. Here the idea is conveyed that the inner life of the player determines the performance and is reflected in his playing. Thus, also the stiff playback of MIDI is gladly made more alive in a humanizer program. By stochastic procedures, the playback becomes more inaccurate and is supposed to sound more human. But what if we can record the MIDI exactly and play it back with all parameters? Depending on the instrument, this might include these parameters like tempo, timing, attack velocity, note duration, note variation, vibrato, tremolo, detuning, etc. You name it. For example, several recordings of Glenn Gould's Goldberg variation have been transcribed as MIDI. Now one could feed a machine with several recordings of great pianists and organists and derive rules for the interpretation of classical works by an artificial intelligence. What does it mean for the reception by human listeners that no human is necessary at the instrument anymore? That the console possibly remains empty? What is missing is the body and possibly also the history of this person and his relation to the instrument.
These are classic questions that arise from working with machines. But if we think about it the other way around, we can assume that musicians automate themselves to a certain extent. By practicing certain rhythmic patterns, scales, chords and phrases, the players incorporate these into their body and their mind. It has to become their second nature. This is equally true for improvisation. Recent psychological research indicates that intuition is not much more than the transmission of learned, recognizable patterns and the rapid application of these patterns.
This brings us to the chapter Hypervirtuosity. The three automations of instrument, composition and interpretation mentioned above make possible a characteristic for which we would like to propose the term hypervirtuosity. Here, the playing skills associated with virtuosity, such as speed, simultaneity of different tempos, extreme density of events, and complex polyrhythms, are further enhanced. A good example of this are Nancarrow studies for player piano. By automating pipe organs, for example, their properties as a machine and acoustic synthesizer come to the fore. It is limited only by the data stream, mechanics, acoustic laws, and last but not least, human perception.
Beyond the superhuman abilities, however, more subtle qualities lie dormant in the hypervirtuosity, just as in virtuosity. Oral physical phenomena, gliding transitions between tonal, noisy and rhythmic, continuous automated register changes or widely fanned out chords for which our fingers are too narrow can be realized. Individual velocities between the notes of piano chords or register changes in millisecond intervals. Minimal and continuous changes of note lengths in organs can be used to imitate inwards and outward swinging processes. New types of impossible ornamentation figures as a further development of Baroque ornamentations are possible. This brings us back to the concept of second nature that we talked about before. The garden we are sitting in now is man-made. The fountain behind us is controlled by a pump that is always turned off on Mondays. In this city there are many gardens like that. Unlike the classical European garden, they are designed according to the principle of wabi-sabi, asymmetrical, incorporating decay and imperfection in the partly intuitive design.
We feel similarly about working with machines. We try not to bring the missing human component into the music, but to bring out the unique qualities that result from automation. Instead of developing an improvisation algorithm or making the interpretation more human, we look for idiosyncratic qualities inherent in automated music. In our compositions, we develop complex sound shapes through computer codes. For example, we can generate collections of very many notes, very short but of different length. These cloud-like structures are more reminiscent of sound synthesis than of traditional organ sounds. We then arrange these by hand into sound sculptures.
Contrary to the humanizer mentioned earlier, we are not interested in imitating a human way of playing, but in creating sounds beyond the rigid grid of the DAW, which then sound almost like natural sounds. The image of the machine is still strongly rooted in the early days of industrialization. The 4-to-the-floor bass drum in techno music is almost a cliché of Ford's assembly line, both of which, like Edwin Voti's pianola by the way, originated in the car city of Detroit.
The French radical enlightener Julien Offray de la Métrie considered the human being in his writings on the one hand as a machine, l'homme machine, in 1748, only to compare him shortly thereafter with a plant, in L'homme plante, also in 1748. There are these remarkable analogies of man, technology and nature. The technosphere, which is developing ever faster and more powerfully, is coming even closer to humankind and the biosphere that surrounds him, and can change and shape it ever more profoundly. Eventually, a distinction between nature and technology will become obsolete. Technology itself will become a kind of second nature. The famous sentence of the British science fiction writer and physicist Arthur C. Clarke that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic adds a spiritual level to this complex of thoughts.
So we hope you enjoyed this little excursus into automation of music, and send the best regards from Kyoto. Ciao.
Ciao.